Welcome back, everyone. We hope that you are enjoying the event today and enjoyed the morning's programming. It is my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Tasnim Jaisee, President of the University of Saskatchewan Students' Union. Tasnim, a student of political studies and women's and gender studies, is the outgoing president of the Arts and Science Student Union and current president of the University of Saskatchewan Students' Union. Tasnim has been a social justice advocate and has led academic support initiatives for students. She has volunteered with several other groups on campus and delivered a TEDx USask talk in September 2019 about overcoming adversities related to her physical disability. In Tasnim's presentation, titled An Intersectional Approach to Community Empowerment and Governance, Tasnim will use an intersectional lens to discuss her lived experiences as a woman of color with disabilities. She explores challenges and obstacles in her advocacy. She will also discuss the impact of community empowerment. Lastly, Tasnim will share the need for representation in governance. As the current USSU president, she understands the importance of empowering diverse student perspectives and making space to amplify marginalized identities. Please welcome Tasnim.
A few weeks ago, my brother and I were playing a video game, and I lost to him. So he's teasingly said, "You're so unlucky." And I wanted to tease back. So I said, after pointing to my wheelchair, "Duh, I clearly have not had luck on my side." Jokes like this have taken me a long time to find humor in. For a while in my life, I truly believed I was one of the unluckiest people ever to be going through my experiences. Within the first few seconds of my life during the delivery process, both of my femurs, the body's strongest bones, broke. My parents were warned by doctors that I'd have a life expectancy of just 6 months. I have a mix of type 3 and type 4 osteogenesis imperfecta. I'll be using the short term OI to reference this condition. And for those of you who don't know, it is also known as brittle bone disorder. And it affects every single bone in my body. I don't need to fall in order to have a break. Just the slight amount of pressures on any single one of my bones can cause a fracture. I have had fractures from cases where, when I was little, I pushed a blanket off myself with my legs, I broke a femur, and just arm fractures from simply trying to reach out to my mom and bumping my hand on her shoulder. That's how easily I broke. And though I'm not as fragile due to a lot of medical support, I still constantly have to be careful. I occasionally have broken collarbones just from the stress I get from pushing my wheelchair, and I have to keep going. And when I was invited to speak here at this TEDx event, I went to my mom to give her a high five, and she immediately stopped me and warned me to high five her gently, that in case with a too strong high five because of my excitement, I may just end up hurting my arm. This is my life. The life I have lived includes sneezes that have fractured my ribs, countless dosages of intravenous medication, over 10 bone remodeling surgeries, and years of strenuous therapy, all thanks to OI. All people with disabilities manage their situations and conditions in their own ways. So I'm not here to speak over other disabled people's perspectives, but what I am about to share with you are just my personal struggles of overcoming the many aspects of my incurable disorder. My childhood was not only full of all this physical pain, but mentally painful was the understanding that I was growing up so differently from everyone else. Just from the small things such as having to sit outside at recess and watch all my friends play on the playground, and I couldn't participate. And I couldn't do the fun things like go to gym class with the rest of my friends. And you know, those times during classroom discussions where you sat on the floor, I couldn't do all that. And even though these were little things, they added up to a huge disconnect between me and my classmates. And this isolation continued into my teenage years because I couldn't attend all these parties that everyone was getting to go to because, of course, if anyone fell on me, I would seriously be hurt. I couldn't get these after-school jobs high school students would get, just like my friends were getting, because people didn't want to hire somebody who was in a wheelchair. That really hurt. All of these experiences that I was getting to miss out on because of my disability. And no matter how hard I was trying to keep up with everything, life was going too fast for me. And the feeling of constantly being left behind took a toll on my mental health. I was overwhelmed because I just wanted to be accepted by others. And it was hurtful. It was hurtful blaming myself for this disability and seeing myself as a burden, not just in the eyes of others, but also in the eyes of myself. And I've come a long way from all these negative thoughts. And I'm at a point in my life where I've achieved so much more than I ever could have possibly thought. I'm attending university, I'm living almost independently, and I have a job. And I know that these are basic things for a lot of people, but for me, these are big achievements because I don't know how my health will change tomorrow even. And I don't know if I'll be able to manage it, but what I can do now is work with what I have and hope that I stay healthy enough in order to live my life unconditionally. It took a long time for me to accept that I was never going to be cured of my condition. And that's okay. That's okay because I have a lot more to give to this world. I will live with this body for the rest of my life, and I'm going to choose to live with it every single day, no matter how hard it gets. And without a cure, I can be happy, and I'm okay living like this. By being disabled, I know that I have many limitations. However, I refuse to let these limitations stop me from reaching my ambitions and my dreams. I will work with what I have. I acknowledge that there will be many adversities in my life, but as I mentioned, all the abilities that I picked up before, I'm not going to stop right here, and I will keep going. I can sit here, cry, stay angry and bitter, but that's not going to change my situation. It's about getting up every day and believing that I can do this. I have the power to go on through this day, no matter how hard it can be tomorrow or even the rest of the day. There are still moments where all of this feels really unfair. It feels unfair that I have to work almost twice as hard to get the basic things in life. And it's painful thinking about it in the long run. This world can be cruel to people who don't fit the social norms, the awkward stares I get from others, and to the people who think that I'm lesser than them just from seeing me in a wheelchair. To the heavy doors with no wheelchair access button, to the ramps that are just too steep, curbs with no ramp cuts that I can get on top of, streets with no sidewalk, and every single sidewalk slab that's a bit uneven, it takes a longer time for me to get my wheelchair on top of those. And these are just some of the many, many barriers to my disability that I feel like sometimes in this world that I'm not welcomed. And I don't think I should be feeling like that anymore. The next time you step outside, consider what obstacles are in the way for people with certain disabilities. Whether you know someone who has a disability or have a disability yourself, ableism negatively affects us all. And it is up to me and those who advocate for better acceptance and accessibility for people with disability that we can, as a society, change these things for this generation and the next future generations to come. My journey of advocating for myself is just beginning. My 6-month life expectancy, I have turned it into 20 years. I like to say that OI may have broken several of my bones, but it has yet to break my spirit. My disability does not make my worth lesser, because I am a human being like anyone in this room, a strong-minded individual who hopes to one fateful day change the world for the better. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tasnim Jaisee. I am an undergraduate student at the University of Saskatchewan studying political studies and women's and gender studies. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the current elected president of the University of Saskatchewan Students' Union, also known as the USSU. Today, I speak situated in Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Dakota people. We acknowledge the harm that colonial institutions have done, and we seek to honor and reaffirm our relationships with one another on this land as we work to dismantle the systemic barriers that First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and other marginalized peoples face. The video that you just saw of myself 2 years ago, speaking about my lived experiences at the time, and the points I raised, I believe, remain as relevant as ever today when it comes to addressing ableism in our society. And in further speaking on those points and adding in details in situating myself into this discussion today, I am speaking by identifying as a Bangladeshi immigrant woman of color with disabilities. And I'm speaking also only for myself, to not speak over others, but just to simply be here to speak from my own personal lived experiences and perspectives. I'm here to talk about an intersectional approach to community empowerment and governance, and specifically student governance. I'll be sharing some personal stories and relating the conversation back to the overall core themes of this presentation. When it comes to governance, it's clear that there are issues very much when it comes to representation of marginalized identities in leadership roles. The barriers that exist are quite layered in itself. Women, for example, face multi-layered issues, and this cycle is also then fueled by a lack of support, which remains as a big problem, as shown, for example, in 2018 during a meeting of the House and Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women, where the executive director of the Samara Center of Democracy presented, and I quote, the following findings: men are six times more likely than women to be selected as candidates, and that's when everything is held constant. So again, it's not supply, it's demand, and it really comes down to the will of the parties, regardless of the electoral systems that we use. If party leaders want more women candidates, they'll make it happen. And so reading that, I personally recognize how once those types of issues appear, there seems to then lead to eventual disinterest for folks or with marginalized identities, or women even, to pursue politics as a whole. And while this is happening in real-world politics, it also made me reflect on student governance structures at our university. I am the first immigrant woman to ever be elected as the president of the USSU, as well as the overall 8th woman ever to be president. And now we should be asking, why is that? What causes a lack of representation? This organization has existed for more than 100 years, so what is the gap in representation? What causes lack of representation of minority identities in governance and leadership roles as a whole? And what are the disparities that still exist today? Considering the fact that this issue is being mirrored even at student unions across this nation, what causes women and individuals with minority identities to not nominate themselves for these roles? And in my findings, there are no easy answers, and there are no self-help books about the right path. Many of the systems and institutions that we navigate essentially were not built to create space for us folks with marginalized identities, and rather that individuals with marginalized and oppressed identities have had to continuously fight for representation, to have a seat at the decision-making tables, and are still having to do that in every corner of society. For myself, patriarchy, racism, and ableism are not concepts that are unfamiliar at all. And I think for a lot of us with marginalized identities, it takes a lot to constantly remind ourselves in not normalizing or internalizing negative stereotypes. And to constantly recognize that we are not flawed, our identities are not the issue. It is the systems which works against our identities. That's where the issues lie, and that's where the problems lie as well. Women with disabilities for so long have been considered to be less capable, for example, compared to able-bodied men, both in terms of their gender and disability. There's also an issue of disregarding disabilities when it comes to retelling experiences of individuals, which then leads to us not fully allowing us to grasp the layers of how oppression works. And these layered identities affect us in every way, from healthcare, careers, housing, independent living, and so many other basic needs as well. Being a woman of color with a disability, it took a long time for me to embrace my identity and find power within it. As a woman, as a person of color, and as someone who has disabilities, when I exist, I don't get to leave parts of my identity at home sheltered. I carry them with me every moment of living, and I recognize my identity as a form of resilience all around. If my voice was not going to be heard, that I would create space for myself to be heard. Intersectionality is a term that I learned when I started my degree at the University of Saskatchewan. And I really like this term because as a singular term, it really helped me to understand my lived experiences and the experiences of those around me as well. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw developed the term to explain how race, gender, class, and other identity factors also merge or sometimes even collide and intersect with each other. And for myself, it was about finding community empowerment and strengths within the community I was surrounded by, which allowed me to find my voice and speak up and learn about leadership from those around me who were there to uplift and support my voice. It is about staying connected and being able to learn from those around me with diverse lived experiences while also getting to share my own. But it wasn't always like this, and it took a long time for me to feel comfortable in my own skin and in my own identity. My parents moved to Canada when I was 7 years old, so about 15 years ago, in hopes of creating a better life for us in this country. And it was a journey of hope and ambition. Yet, around that same year, I had my first of many unfortunate experiences of facing racism. One day, my mother and I thought about going shopping. We were newcomers, and we didn't speak good English at the time, and we also didn't own a car, so we thought we'd take the bus, just a fun mother and daughter trip. And as we were sitting there at the bus stop, we were speaking in Bangla, the language we were most familiar with speaking, and a man happened to be there who was also waiting at the stop, who then proceeded to scream and berate us about not speaking English and telling us to go back to our country and everything else you can imagine, the usual racist remarks. We didn't speak up because we were scared to, and we simply waited for it to stop and waited for the bus to arrive to pick us up. When something like this happens, for me it took a little while to recuperate and realize what that whole incident was all about. I was a child, and I had to recognize that that's what racism looked like, and to realize that this behavior towards us was not okay. No one deserves that. And similarly, much like that experience, in my childhood, I struggled a lot to find this balance of how I wanted to present myself versus how others in society may expect me to behave. And for example, at school, I was able to do everything when it came to homework and classwork, but I wanted to be involved in more, just like other kids' extracurricular activities, sports, and much more. It was a lot about me advocating for myself, asking my school to help to create more accommodations, to not just help me, but to help the other few kids in the future who would want to be able to take part in the full spectrum of experiences in schools. And it wasn't always easy as a child. I often felt exhausted. I questioned why these accommodations for students with disabilities at that time just simply did not exist, despite the fact that we have existed forever. And what kept me going during a lot of these times was the support that I received from strong activists and community leaders around me, women and folks with disabilities and racialized identities as well, to be able to share and find comfort and support knowing that I wasn't alone in these types of experiences, that while I could be doing everything right, these types of systemic problems were not my fault, and that they would come up and try to hold me back, but regardless, it was not my fault. And it takes just a little bit of community effort to create pathways of inclusion in our communities. A few years ago, I applied to a job, for example, and I landed an interview, which I was really eager about this particular opportunity. And when I went in for the interview, I came to find out that the office only had one entrance, which was only accessible by stairs, meaning that it wasn't accessible for me. And so we had to do the interview at a local nearby cafe instead. And when it came to the first question of, tell me about yourself, I hesitated. I needed to know if this was going to be even worth my time to dedicate and put energy into this, if I was simply going to be rejected based on the issue of accessibility. At that moment, I happened to turn the question around and I asked what my options were regarding accessibility in this organization. And what I found was that they were I was very lucky because they were very willing to talk about ways how they could potentially find ways for me to work remotely or work out of other offices as well, but still be working for that organization. And I was very fortunate enough to be able to end up landing that job, and I was able to gain a lot of experience in that field as well. But again, I was able to do that because the organization was willing to make those types of accommodations that would not just benefit me, but for those to come in the future as well. If individuals with marginalized identities are not given the chance to feel supported by the communities around them, it affects us negatively. It affects us all. There are many ways to work around truly creating meaningful equity, diversity, and inclusion as well. If we go back to the conversation of governance, in my personal experiences, I often noticed gaps in representation that largely affected me. For example, when I was campaigning for the role of the USask president, there were a lot of these nitty-gritty details, essentially, that my team and I had to think about. And for example, I can't stand, so I couldn't do many of the typical traditional poses for election pictures, for example. How do I pose for my campaign photos to come off friendly, but also send the message that I'm here to be a strong leader, and also recognizing that my disability doesn't hold me back from being a strong leader? All of these thoughts, right? Word choices were something else that I had to constantly think about as well. I felt uncomfortable saying that I was running for X position because I can't physically run. I can't physically do that, right? And so it was a lot about thinking outside the box and choosing more inclusive language as well. So I would say, for example, I'm campaigning for the role of USask president, or other ways along those lines. And there was I felt that there was a lack of points of reference because people who share my lived experiences, their voices have often been left out of these types of leadership roles. So it was something that I had to figure out as I went forward. And then being elected into this role, there was a lot of excitement and hope as well, and I'm thrilled to be working on so many projects and initiatives to focus on creating communication, developing networks, shaping opportunities, and updating policies, and especially to work towards continuously supporting students. And in connecting with students, I'm here to listen and create something meaningful and impactful as well, because I know what it's like to not have your voice heard or to not have your voice represented, and I do not want that reflected in my leadership. I recognize the importance of empowering diverse student perspectives and making space to amplify marginalized voices. I want to create more of an inclusive campus for all students to feel safe and have a fulfilling student experience when partaking in campus culture and the many wonderful activities on campus. And I'm so excited to have led initiatives with my team already, such as some core highlights among the many of creating the first student committee at the USSU, focusing on anti-racism and anti-oppression. We did our first set of accessibility challenges as part of our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Week, where I invited our provost, Dr. Irene, and Troy Lindsley, Director of Facilities, to tour around campus with me using wheelchairs, and we explored insides and outsides of buildings to discuss many of the physical barriers on campus and when it comes to mobility and overall the issues of accessibility as well. And also, I am supporting the lead of creating many essential conversation with our provincial government and university administration as a whole to create more affordable and accessible ways of achieving education and for specialized resources for Indigenous and international students and much more. And I'm grateful for this opportunity and have so much respect for our student community in their ambitions, creativity, innovation, and diverse strengths as well. And it's a pleasure and an honor to serve in this role to support USask undergraduate students. And I'm greatly looking forward to continuing to utilize the ways that I see the world with my unique lived experiences in the ways that I lead with compassion, empathy, and understanding too. In my personal and in my professional and work life, so many bright positives have come out for myself and those around me, and I do not consider my identity, as I have mentioned, to ever be something that is a hindrance to me. Yet, ever so often in my personal life, simply existing as myself, there's still many challenges, and how I get through it is that my motto remains the same, that when it comes to, it all needs to be about active resilience against oppression and marginalization as well. For example, about a month ago, when I was heading home from work after a work day, I had accidentally dropped my phone to the ground, and this took place outside, and with my barriers of mobility, it is very difficult for me to reach to the ground and pick something up. And so I needed to ask for help. I saw someone standing a few meters away from me, and I asked if they could please pick up my phone. And they had not noticed initially that I dropped the phone, and they responded to my request by asking, "Is it yours?" To which I explained yes, and that I had dropped it and I'm having difficulties picking it up from the ground. Then they simply said no to my request. And I felt a bit confused. I wasn't sure what to do in that instance, and I looked around to see if anyone else would be there to just help pick up my phone. And in the next few moments, the same individual did proceed to pick up my phone and hand it to me, to which I thanked them. And while I had the phone in my hands, just checking to make sure that it was okay, they asked, "Are you sure that's yours?" Again, it was one of those moments where I later had to piece it all together to actually recognize and understand why things happened the way they did. And I connected back to recognizing that there's a lot of negative stereotypes about people with disabilities often being portrayed quite negatively in the media and news, such as being very devious, bad faith, manipulative, etc. You get the picture. And I assumed it was someone who was also thinking that of me and placing those labels on me when all I simply wanted to do was get my phone back. Those moments can be quite defeating, no matter how much you learn to grow thick skin. It can get frustrating, it can be confusing. You can do everything correctly, but societal closed-mindedness and oppression and institutional barriers still exist and actively works against us. And for myself, it remains all about grounding myself in positive thoughts and wishing growth for myself and for those around me, to know that I can find strength in communities of shared identities and that there are folks who get it and who do want to make change to this world around them. Even when I was making certain edits to this presentation, I had certain moments of asking myself, is this relevant? Is this relatable? Do people care? And I quickly had to snap out of those thoughts, because we need people to care, to listen to each other, to understand and empathize and remain in solidarity with diverse lived experiences around us, and to build communities that are learning from each other and seeking pathways of equity, diversity, and inclusion. In our communities, I also believe it's really important that we're also, that those with certain privileged identities use their identities to uplift marginalized voices. Community of leaders raise community of leaders. I myself could not have reached where I am without a strong support system from my family and allies around me. To my mom and my grandmother, who would buy me books from a young age, encouraging to open my mind and learn about the world around me, to continue to strive breaking barriers towards educating myself. And they know that there would be many barriers in my life, but they believed in me and hoped for me to continue. To my childhood best friend, Nabiha Perzada, who didn't see me as different in grade school, always there to make me feel included, who still to this day cheers me on in my achievement as I do for hers. I'm honored and lucky every day to be surrounded by such strong women, even in this university. Dr. Murray Lovrod, whose incredible work in academia inspires me always to strive towards my degree in women's and gender studies, who also taught me so much about thinking critically about the world around me, and especially the systems around us with a focus on critical disability studies. To Leah Story Gamble, who went the extra mile to support my campaign as my campaign manager and is actively dedicated in her activism work within our community. Autumn LaRose Smith, who was the former USSU president and the first Indigenous woman ever to hold this role, always spoke about how she wanted more women to be in the USSU president role, inspiring me to also follow in her leadership. Even being here today on this stage to have this conversation, Namarta Kochar, who reached out to invite me here as part of the EDI Champions group, just so honored to have her as a dear friend who's always there to uplift my efforts and being so supportive. These wonderful individuals and so many more have made such a difference to my life. And again, this is the beauty of community empowerment, to be there for each other and to unite in our shared understanding of making positive change. I'm also grateful to the audience here as part of our university community who came out to support this event today. We have the power to come together to make change and uplift each other, members of our communities, and create equal representation and governance, and so much more. Each and every one of us has something to share that makes us unique. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Tasnim. I heard words like community empowerment, advocacy, resilience, voice, and I think I would add to your words, my words, inspiration and courage. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and for that thought-provoking presentation. Thank you so much.